Hello, and in today's video we're going to return to the planet of Tékumel, which you may remember I discussed by having a look at the Béthorm role-playing game. And I started with this particular product because it was the only sort of officially in-print product that you could get off Amazon and various other sources. However, what we're going to talk about today is the product that introduced Tékumel to the gaming world, and that is M.A.R of the Petal Throne. Now, this was published way back in 1975 as a very deluxe box set, costing TSR lots of money, and it was basically a spin-off of original Dungeons and Dragons. And as you can see here, I've got a self-published version of the PDF on Drivethrurpg, but I'm not going to show you that. What I'm going to show you is the official print-on-demand option that is also now available on Drivethrurpg. So you can see it's a bigger format on a glossy paper with a pretty nice production quality actually. Now, because it's bigger, I do think that does sadly mean that some of the text on occasion is a little bit blurrier than on the smaller print. But to be honest, nothing to worry about. Now, on the back of the book, it tells you a little bit about M.A.R of the Petal Throne, but it's pretty Spartan. And when we open up, we start off with what really captured people's imaginations. Now, bear in mind, D&D came out in 1974 as the little white box. And then just 1 year later, we got this magnificent campaign for Tékumel with its own font, its own language. And this was, really big thing to do way back in 1975. Now, there is a bit of blurb here about how it came out. So TSR published it. It was then republished by Different Worlds in 1984, then republished again in 2013. And I believe this is a 2017 reprint. But it's effectively the same product as you would have got in 1975. So you've got a table of contents, which is broken down in sort of wargaming style. Section 100, section 300, subsection 310. We've then got a little introduction, which was written by Gygax. Then we have a new introduction written by Different Worlds. And then we actually get into the 3 booklets that formed the original game. Now, I say 3 booklets, but I think they actually just came in one rulebook, even though they were split into 3. And this shows you how this was such an early game that it basically just followed the original D&D format, but it was slightly different. So we've got an introduction as to what this is about. We then get a fairly lengthy and very dense text section, double column, which basically details a little bit about the setting. As you can see there, it just goes on and on and on and on. And then it suddenly drops in character types, which is a little bit bizarre. It says, those of you familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, mentioned above, playing in or refereeing a game based upon Tékumel will present little real difficulty. And this is true to a degree, but Tékumel's always been very intimidating because of its rich setting. Now, characters in this version of the game are good or evil, which later on sort of got retconned into you're either for stability or I've forgotten the official name now, disorder. So they're sort of good or evil gods, but there's not really good or evil in the setting of Tékumel. It also talks about the underworld, which I think was a bit more of a feature in this version and is a bit less of a feature in later settings. It talks about picking your sex of your character, which doesn't actually matter. Men have an easier time of it by default, but women very easily can declare themselves Aradana, and then that they're just as good as men in this setting, although people who don't do that maybe will get mistreated as women. And there's also slaves in this, so it is a bit challenging for some modern tastes. So you've then got profession, which is not the same thing as your class, because like original D&D, you've got the fighter, the mage, and the cleric, basically, although they're not called that in this. It does talk a little bit about non-human alignment for your rather weird and wonderful alien races. So you've got people who are friendly to man, neutral or hostile to man. You then roll your abilities, basic talents as it talks about them here. So you've got strength, intelligence, all very D&D, but notice the stats are 1 to 100, not 1 to 18. So percentile dice are being used. So constitution, all very D&D. Oh, what's this? Psychic ability. Well, that's replaced wisdom, dexterity, and then comeliness, which changes charisma. So in comeliness, it is actually sort of beauty and handsomeness rather than pure charm. Psychic ability is basically how good you are at communicating with the gods. So you can tweak your stats. You then set up your record sheet. You then get some skills based on your background and your class. So there's a few bits and pieces in here. And it talks about levelling them up, because this does use levels. And you've got specific professional skills. So the warrior has their own skills, the priests have their own skills, magic users have their own skills, including obviously spells. We then get a whole load of stuff about spells. Now, interestingly, in this game, spells are not automatic. You have to actually roll to cast them. And what is it? Level 1, there's a 60% chance that the spell doesn't work. So you've effectively got a 40% ability in the spell. You've then got XP and levels, just like D&D. And you've got reduced experience points from, I guess, dealing with things that are beneath you. In a nod to original D&D, each level comes with a level name. So a level 1 fighter is a soldier, although if you use the language of the game, it's the Changadasha, and at level 2 they become a Kurothanol, or a heavy infantry. Apologies for the Tékumel purists who know how to pronounce this stuff. Hit dice, now apparently in here it is much more precise. So you roll d6 per level, but what you do is you actually, every time you level up, you roll your dice in their entirety and see if you've improved your hit points. And if you do, you then increase your hit points. So at, let's say level 3, you're rolling 3d6. You don't roll 1d6 and add it to your existing hit point. You literally roll 3d6, and if you roll higher than your current hit points, then they increase. So you're quite squishy in this game. It's very much original D&D. Combat, so rather weirdly, even though we've got D100, they've decided to go to D20 now. I suppose you could easily retcon that by translating a D20 into a D100. I believe you times it by 5 to do that. But that would then involve rewriting the hit table, which here, of course, has ditched chainmail from original D&D and gone with the alternative combat system. However, you'll notice the armour class is armour class 1 for iron plate mail, and that's because, don't forget, Tékumel, there is no metal really to speak of. So plate mail as we would know it on Tékumel is made from chelm hide. That's your AC2, but AC1 is special metal, which is hard to get hold of. It also details with how the monsters are going to hit you here, various weapons that you roll, including missile fire. Now, I can't remember, do your character classes determine the damage, or is it just D6? Yeah, so most weapons do D6 of damage, but there are some that do D4 and stuff like that. So yeah, it is very original D&D. We've then got a bit about combat round and dexterity, so I wonder if Holmes was inspired by Tékumel to have dexterity as initiative. We then got large combats, we then got the damage dice here, and how many hits I guess monsters can have. But what we got? Yeah, double damage. So this is like critical damage and instant death. You've got morale. You've then got the the gladiator arenas, the Hirakati. Then got a nice picture of priest about to sacrifice someone. So let's move past that. So starting the game, now it does recommend you start with a little bit of money and your foreigners in Jakala, I believe it is. And it does talk about the money here. So the gold pieces, the kaitar, then the silver pieces, the hash, which is 20 silver to 1 gold. And then we've got the 20 copper kigul to the Hlash. We got an equipment list, so sword made out of chelm hide is 10k. So that's not 10,000, that's 10 kaitar or 10 gold pieces. So again, the silver piece economy was rejected early on and went with the gold economy. We've got encumbrance, we've got NPCs, so slaves and soldiers and harlins and so on. Now, because the social system is really important in Tékumel, you would hire porters, you would hire bodyguards to do stuff that's sort of beneath you. Now, unfortunately, I believe Tékumel, as it was presented in Empire of the Petal Throne, although it went on a bit about how social class is quite important, there's nothing in the rules about that. So that's something where maybe Béthorm's done a bit better, and I would be tempted personally to take the Béthorm clan and social status rules and maybe sort of backport them to Empire of the Petal Throne, because I do actually prefer Empire of the Petal Throne. I guess one reason being I'm very much used to original D&D and D&D in general, so that's a bit easier for me. But I have to see. I do want to give Béthorm a good shout at the table. So we then got a load of stuff about encounters, including encounters with flyers, non-humans, animals, swimmers. So it depends where you are as to what sort of encounter you get. We then get some like full-page artwork, which, okay, by modern standards, it's not the best artwork, but it's not bad. And a lot of it you can see how it inspired later artists. And it's quite evocative, so I quite like it, despite its sort of naivety. We then got animal encounters, so this is all very similar to Béthorm, to be honest, and you can see how Béthorm sort of took inspiration from the past. So we've got sea encounters. We've then got a little bit about the underworld and how to move around in the underworld and the various locations of some known underworlds. So then there's specific creatures of the underworld, which obviously are potentially much nastier. We then get into book 3, and in book 3 we get hit straight away with the eyes. So the abominable eye of detestation, which causes 1 to 12 beings to flee from the user in utter horror and revulsion. And then it goes on, and there's quite a few eyes described in this. Is it 30? Yeah, 36 eyes. Are described in this original set of rules. The availability in the cost. Then we get amulets. There's 12 of those, I believe. Then how much they cost. Various magical items. There's lots and lots of those. 24, in fact. Scrolls. Determination scrolls. What language are they in, and what spells do they have? Availability and cost of those. Books. And again, we've got quite a few books described here. In fact, 24. Magical weapons and armour comes next, so iron and steel, potentially, really good stuff. And of course it then gets into edged weapons, which I believe are only usable by the fighting man, and they are like your D&D ego swords, so really does sort of just lift almost wholesale original D&D into the rules at this point. So non-player characters and magical weapons. Saving throws. Then we get into the gods. So we've got the good gods and the evil gods, although, as I say, that's not really a particularly good description. So Hanala, the supreme principle of good, the Lord whose name may not be known, master of light and foe of evil. Okay, so there you go. And then his, equivalent from the Tolequalalu, I believe it's pronounced. So Hiri, the supreme principle of evil, master of negation and non-being, opponent of good and dispenser of calamities. And then you've got the cohorts, the lesser gods, who represent sort of different aspects, I guess, of the two sides. But it doesn't seem to go on about some of the other gods here from other nations, etc. We then got a bit about divine intervention, because a bit like the Greek gods interfering with their favourite heroes, these gods are quite happy to turn up and intervene. We then get into the sort of treasure and treasure tables, and then we get into longer term campaign stuff, so supporting yourself, salaries, jobs, fiefdoms, taxes, erecting your buildings, advertising for people to come and help and stuff like that, relatives and wills, tracking time, a little bit of information for referees, developing your underground, and then I think we get a little bit of a sort of actual play bit. Yeah, here, so player, we take the stairs, referee, 10, 20, 30 feet down, stairs end, door to the north. We listen at the door, roll some dice, you hear nothing. So, sort of real throwback there to how it used to be done back in the 70s. So how to develop a scenario, developing your NPCs, developing other regions, and then we get into a rather wonderful bit talking about how I should have been pronouncing all the stuff that I've been mispronouncing, how to write it, including a font. So in English, the TS is represented by these three icons, and the icons you use would depend on whether it's at the start of the word, the end of the word, or just generally what's in the middle. So that's a gross simplification. So let's just give you a closer look here at the I, A and O. So you've got initial and then the medial or final. So yeah, really good, and it must cost them quite a lot of money to try and produce this back in the 70s. We then got a lovely example of the sort of script, which sort of like, I guess Arabic, reads from right to left rather than left to right. We then got a citizenship, which has the font translated into the actual text. And then underneath, it's sort of a bit confusing because it's indeed in the name great powerful of the emperor, great excellent powerful, given is that. So it doesn't flow in English quite the way you'd expect it to. So that's something that can catch you out. We then got a key for a map that's coming up. But what I find particularly interesting is they've replicated this little component list. So the actual rule book that I'm holding here would have cost me $12 back in the day. The box it would have come in would have cost me $2. The maps that I would have got with it, $15, and then some dice, $89. Well, 2, 14, 19, $29. $29 was a lot of money in 1975, particularly when the white box was $10, so 3 times the cost. So you can see why Tékumel was very beloved, but also maybe not a great seller compared to original D&D. So here's Jakala, the sort of starting area for Empire of the Petal Throne. We've then got a nice sort of empire map of Tsolyani, and Jakala's this little spot down here. And then on a double page spread, we get where Tsolyani is in relation to the rest of the world. And yeah, that's pretty good for a product that sort of came out of nowhere, if you think about it. It's everything you need in one book. This section here, I guess, is almost like a referee's screen of summaries of things, including a complete sort of monster manual bestiary here. What else have we got? Yes, we've then got other fantasy releases by TSR, and then this is a sort of new bit talking about what replaced Empire of the Petal Throne, which will be in a follow-up video, but I don't know so much about this, so it's going to take me a while to get my head around it. It's a 2-volume game system, which we'll talk about, as I say, when we get around to it. And then, of course, the wonderful Man of Gold gets a little advertising slot. So there you go, that's that. So you can buy this print on demand, and if you're not sure if you want to do that, I recommend you pick up the PDF. As you can see, it prints out really nicely, looks pretty good. The only problem is when you print it out at A5, I mean, look how tiny that text is. It's really tricksy to see, although the graphics print nicely. So here you go, let's have a look here in a section on combat, so the damage dice, let's see. So as you can see, you can read it, but you know, at this distance that's pretty hard to read. So you know, you pay some money, you take your choice. Buy the PDF, print it out yourself, or get the pod, which is actually going to take up less space, ironically, than this. This is quite thick and bulky. But yeah, I really enjoyed reading Empire of the Petal Throne. I need to reread it again to really get it fresh in my mind. I've spent a lot of time recently on some other game systems. But basically, if you treat it as more or less original D&D, but with percentile dice, you can't go too far wrong. What makes Empire of the Petal Throne really unique was the fact it was, I believe, the first ever published campaign setting. So it's not necessarily the first ever campaign setting, but it was the first ever published one, and it's so rich and so rewarding a setting that I think you can have a lot of fun with it. So remember, Tékumel is sort of an Asian, Persian, Babylonian sort of setting rather than a medieval Western feudal setting. So it's very different, very alien, and I really enjoyed reading the Man of Gold, and it really got my creative juices going for Empire of the Petal Throne again. So given the choice between Béthorm or Empire of the Petal Throne, it's tricky. Empire of the Petal Throne, I think, in some ways is better if you know D&D, but it does suffer from the fact it's basically original D&D, which, you know, for some people is a problem. Now Béthorm does a much better job at sort of building into the mechanics and also the description in the rulebook of the social system, which Empire of the Petal Throne sort of glosses over a bit. So yeah, it is a really tricky one. Now for me, I actually found Empire of the Petal Throne easier to track down and buy compared to Béthorm, but ironically Béthorm was the one I could buy straight off Amazon. It suddenly popped up on Amazon as a product I could buy. So if I really had to choose, I would probably go with Empire of the Petal Throne just from a pure familiarity with the basic underlying rules. But I really do quite enjoy Béthorm with the slightly improved production quality, the better artwork, the slightly more modern game engine, but it's different and therefore not as comfortable for me. So there you go. After a totally non-committal, yeah, I'm not sure, but possibly Empire of the Petal Throne, I think I will end this video. So I hope you've enjoyed that look at a grand classic game back from the 70s. So until the next one, happy gaming.